who experiences discrimination? I think that this is something that's really important to understand, just so that we can validate that this is an experience that many minority individuals have in the US. Discrimination and prejudice is still very alive and real. It has become something over time that's become a little bit more covert or subtle, but the impact is not subtle. The impact is not small. With the current crisis, the discrimination has become more overt or blatant. And I'll talk about that in the next few slides. So when we think about discrimination, I think it could be really helpful to understand it psychologically, so that we can excuse the behavior or make it right, but so that we can understand what might motivate someone to do this, and that might help us to understand our own response to it, hopefully. So there's many theories of prejudice and discrimination. One that I'll talk about today is the idea that discrimination is something someone does in defense of themselves. So if they're dealing with some sort of feeling that is uncomfortable, or an experience that is painful, or if they just don't really feel great about themselves, they want to protect themselves, they might engage in discrimination. It's typically aligned to maybe a bully or something like that. Like maybe they're being bullied in some other way, or they have a lot of emotions they don't know how to deal with, and so they respond in this really unhelpful and harmful way. Who gets discriminated against is actually defined by the groups that are in power in our society. And so we call these groups the majority group or the dominant group, and they have a level of privilege that means that they don't experience discrimination, or if they do experience unfair treatment, it doesn't impact them in the same ways as those groups without privilege. And those groups are stigmatized groups, namely groups that do not share that privileged status with the majority group, and because of that they suffer a lot more consequences of unfair treatment. Those individuals in this group tend to have a characteristic, or more likely a set of characteristics, that are devalued in some way. So I think about this in terms of like fat culture. So many people have devalued individuals who carry body fat on their body, especially in certain areas, and we've seen how that has evolved over time. But generally, because having fat is not valued and is seen as unattractive, those individuals who carry fat on their body in those ways are also devalued. And that characteristic distinguishes that person from the majority. It's a very visual thing. It's something that you can see. And so we think about things like race. It's very visual, and you can distinguish that person from the majority group based off of those visual characteristics. And then that group and those individuals are considered to be deviant for that reason, because they're different, and there's often a lot of shame that's ascribed to them. Frequently, those individuals are objectified, and this is important to understand, because if you objectify someone, or you treat them or see them as an object or as indistinguishable from other people in that group, right, you can dehumanize them. If you can take the human individual quality away from somebody, it is much easier to hurt them and mistreat them, right? If you see someone as no different from like an office chair, you don't necessarily have as many of the barriers to treating them in an unfair way as you would if you saw them as a person with emotions and feelings and unique qualities. And so I see this a lot in the Asian and Asian American populations, when we just even talk about them in that way, right? Even just referring to this very diverse group of different ethnicities, different nationalities, different cultures as Asian, we can really dehumanize them, and we don't see them as individuals. And thus, discrimination and prejudice is sort of sanctioned towards this group in our society. And I'm not saying it's not sanctioned for other groups, but this is one of the reasons why it is still sort of a part of many people's comedy routines to scapegoat or take or laugh at Asian or Asian American individuals. It's still very much a part of our pop culture, and it certainly is a part of our interactions now in the light of COVID-19. And I just wanted to highlight this quote by the Dalai Lama. All suffering is caused by ignorance. People inflict pain on others in the selfish pursuit of their own happiness or satisfaction. And I think that rings true, at least for how I can understand this phenomenon. Another thing that's important to understand is there are many stigmatized groups, but some groups have more harmful stigma than others. And if you have a harmful stigma, there are really direct negative consequences that are just worse than if you have a more benign stigma. And it's not to say that, stigma is ever okay, but it's good to recognize that it's on a spectrum. And so the things that predict that are course, concealability, aesthetic qualities, origin, and danger. So firstly, whether that identity is a long-lasting chronic one or a temporary one, a stable one versus an unstable. So if it's more chronic and long-lasting or stable, that's going to have longer-term, more consistent negative consequences for that person. If it's a more temporary situation, or if it's sort of unstable in some ways, then there are definitely negative consequences, but they're not as consistent and therefore not as long-term harmful for that person's health. So I think about this in terms of things like identities that are lifelong, like gender or sex, right? Those typically can be lifelong, although if we can recognize the trans community as well, there are exceptions to that. And when we think about something such as perhaps wealth, sometimes that is something that can change over time, for the better or for the worse. And so we would see more negative consequences for something that's more stable in terms of identity. Concealability. So how easily can you hide or control that visibility of that identity if you're a stigmatized person? Race is one that is often very difficult to conceal. However, if you think about multiracial individuals such as myself, sometimes that can vary depending on the space that you're in. And it depends wholly on that other person's perceptions. When we look at things like across different minority groups, so if you look at Black individuals or African American individuals, there tends to be something like the one drop rule, where very much if you are any percentage of that race, it is something that is a part of a stigmatized identity. It is very salient in our culture due to our history of slavery, and just the way that we have sort of we have oppressed Black and African American individuals. So that's something to think about. Something that's more concealable might be something like sexual orientation. Now that has negative consequences as well, but if you can conceal it, then you can control like where you are stigmatized in some spaces, in some cases. So that's just for the sake of example. Obviously, there are a lot of within group differences here. Aesthetic qualities. So generally, if you are perceived to be more attractive by the dominant group, you will have less negative consequences of stigma. And again, that is defined by that dominant group. So what is attractive is actually something that is very subjective. It's not something that we measure objectively. It is culturally dependent. Origin. So how did you come to be that part of that group, right? So if it feels like it's something that's under your control, there is less sympathy for you and a lot more anger. So I think of, and that's why I have this picture here, I think of substance use. And sometimes people do have substance abuse issues, and ultimately we don't regard those people very well. We discriminate against those people. We talk about denying those people things like healthcare because we view that the origin of their stigma was within their control. And while it might be true that it was that person's decision to use that substance the first time, addiction is a very powerful thing. And while some people can use things once and they don't become addicted, many people can use things a few times and they become very powerfully addicted physiologically. And to stop doing that is something that's very hard to do without professional help. And so we don't have a lot of pity for those individuals, unfortunately, but that is what makes it a harmful stigma. And finally, danger. So how dangerous that person is perceived to be, especially to the majority group, that will determine how much stigma is happening as well, and how harmful it is. And so when we think of the shootings that have been happening for a long time but are now recognized by larger society, or at least the media, the shootings of Black males, that is arguably due to them having a stereotype of being dangerous to others and being more prone to violence. And so you see these things where unarmed black men and boys are being killed by police officers because they are assumed to be dangerous in the moment. And even though the facts of the situation were like that person or persons, they didn't have a weapon on them, they are being brutally killed out there, and it's sanctioned by our society. So that is a very harmful stigma. You can see right there, death is a very probably the worst consequence that there could be for a stigma. And so the idea with this is to give you a sense of, how does society perceive us, and how might this translate into discrimination?